The millionaire ordered the pregnant woman expelled. Until he heard the name she gave the baby, a millionaire ordered a pregnant woman removed from his property. She was dirty, desperate, begging for help. He turned his back. But when he heard the name she gave the baby, his entire world collapsed. Today, you're going to discover how an act of cruelty transformed into the greatest life lesson a rich man ever received. I'll show you exactly what happened at that gate, why that woman was there, and the shocking truth behind the baby's name that changed everything. Stay until the end, because this twist will make you rethink every judgment you've ever made about someone. Before we start, tell me in the comments, have you ever judged someone by their appearance and later discovered you were completely wrong? This story will make you think twice before judging again. It was a rainy Tuesday when Margaret Chen arrived at the Whitmore mansion gate. Her shoes were soaked, holes in the soles. Her 8-month pregnant belly pressed against an old coat that no longer closed. Hair stuck to her face from the rain, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. She pressed the intercom button on the iron gate that protected the $15 million property. Perfectly manicured gardens extended as far as the eye could see. An Italian marble fountain sprayed crystal water in the center of the circular driveway. The mansion had 3 floors, 22 bedrooms, and more bathrooms than Margaret could count. On the other side of that gate was Richard Whitmore, 58 years old, CEO of one of the largest technology companies on the East Coast, net worth of $140 million, 2 ex-wives, 0 children, and a heart that had become as cold as the marble of his fountain. Richard was in his second-floor office when the intercom rang. He looked at the security screen and saw Margaret standing in the rain. His first thought wasn't compassion, it was irritation. "James," he called his personal security guard over the radio. "There's a homeless woman at the gate. Get her out of there." James, a 42-year-old man who had worked for Richard for a decade, walked to the gate. Through the iron bars, he looked at Margaret. "Miss, you need to leave." "This is private property. Please," Margaret said, her voice barely coming out. "I just need to speak with Mr. Whitmore. Just 5 minutes, please. Mr. Whitmore doesn't receive visitors without an appointment, especially doesn't receive people who—" He paused, looking her up and down, "who show up like this." Margaret felt tears mixing with the rain on her face. "You don't understand. I need to talk to him. It's about something that happened a long time ago. It's about someone he knew." In the office, Richard watched through the camera, his finger tapping impatiently on the mahogany desk. He had built that fortune from scratch, had started with nothing and become everything. And on that path, he had learned a fundamental lesson. At least, that's what he believed. People who had less always wanted to take something from people who had more. "Tell her to go away." Richard spoke into the radio, voice cold. "If she doesn't leave, call the police." Margaret heard this through the intercom that was still open. She placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby kick. "Please," she shouted, looking directly at the camera. "Please, Mr. Whitmore, it's about Sarah Chen. She knew you." Richard froze. That name. He hadn't heard that name in 30 years. Sarah Chen. He grabbed the radio again, but this time his voice was different. There was a crack in the coldness. "Wait, bring her inside." James looked at the radio as if he'd heard wrong. "Sir, you heard me. Bring her to the house, now." 10 minutes later, Margaret was sitting in a velvet chair in the living room that was larger than the entire apartment where she had grown up. Rainwater dripped from her, forming a small puddle on the Italian marble floor. She tried to stand when Richard entered, but he gestured for her to remain seated. Richard studied her for a long moment. She was young, maybe 26 or 27, Asian, as Sarah had been. But beyond that, he saw no resemblance. "You mentioned Sarah Chen," he said, keeping his distance. "How do you know her?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Sarah Chen was my mother." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to have physical weight. Richard slowly sat in the chair opposite her. "Your mother," he repeated. "Yes, she passed away 6 months ago, pancreatic cancer. At the end, she told me about you, about how you met, about what happened between you. Richard felt something moving in his chest, something he had buried 3 decades ago. Let me guess, she told you I abandoned her, that I was a monster, and now you came here pregnant in the rain to make me feel guilty and get money from me. Margaret stared at him, and Richard saw something in her eyes that surprised him. It wasn't anger. It wasn't greed. It was disappointment. She told me you were the most brilliant person she'd ever met, Margaret said calmly. Said you had an incredible gift for understanding technology, for seeing the future before it arrived. But she also said you were so afraid of being used that you built walls around your heart higher than the walls around this house. Richard stood up abruptly. I don't need to hear psychological analysis from a stranger who invades my property. I didn't come here for money, Mr. Whitmore. I came here for answers. And I came here because my mother, even after everything, still believed there was goodness in you, and I wanted to see with my own eyes if she was right or wrong. She was wrong, Richard said, his voice cutting like glass. Now, if you don't need money, then there's no reason to be here. James will call a taxi for you. Margaret stood with difficulty, one hand supporting her belly. My mother worked as your assistant 30 years ago. Do you remember that? I've had hundreds of assistants. She worked 16 hours a day for you, organized your life, made sure you never missed a meeting, never forgot an appointment. She was invisible, but essential. Do you remember that? Richard didn't respond, but something in his expression changed slightly. And when she found out she was pregnant with me, you fired her the same day. Said you couldn't have an assistant who would need maternity leave. Said she had become a liability. That was just business, Richard said, but his voice was less firm. She was 24 years old, no family, no support network, and you threw her out on the street. She spent the next years cleaning offices at night while raising me alone during the day. Worked 3 jobs simultaneously, never asked for help, never asked for a penny from you. So why are you here? Richard asked. Because before she died, she made me promise one thing, that I would come to you and tell you that she forgave you, that she understood you were afraid of being vulnerable, afraid that people only wanted you for your money, and that this fear transformed you into someone who can no longer see humanity in others. Richard felt something tightening in his chest. That was all? She sent you here to say she forgives me? Not exactly. She also asked me to tell you that despite everything, you were important to her. That the 2 years she worked for you before I was born were when she learned about hard work, about excellence, about never accepting less than the best. She said those lessons helped her raise me well, even alone. Margaret walked toward the door, but then turned. Oh, and she asked me to tell you when my baby was born, asked me to tell you the name. Why? Richard asked, confused. Because she wanted you to know that despite everything, she still believed there was goodness in you. Goodness you buried, but that still exists somewhere. And then Margaret left, returning to the rain, leaving Richard alone in his $15 million mansion that suddenly felt very, very empty. 2 weeks passed. Richard couldn't get that conversation out of his head. He found himself thinking about Sarah Chen for the first time in decades. Memories he had suppressed began to return. Sarah at 22, newly hired, with bright eyes full of determination. How she always arrived 15 minutes before him. How she always had his coffee, exactly the way he liked it. How she organized his chaotic life into perfect order. And he remembered the day she came to his office, nervous, hands shaking, to say she was pregnant. Remembered the expression on her face when he said she was fired. Remembered how she just nodded, gathered her things, and left without saying a word. He had rationalized that decision for 30 years. It had been just business, just pragmatism. Couldn't have a pregnant assistant. It was simple as that. But now, sitting in his empty office, for the first time in 3 decades, Richard Whitmore wondered if maybe it had just been cruelty. He called James. Find that woman. Margaret Chen. I need an address. James located Margaret in 3 days. She was living in a temporary shelter for homeless pregnant women. A faded brick building in a part of town Richard had never visited, never thought about, never even considered existed. Richard showed up in a $200,000 Mercedes that looked absurdly out of place on that street. He entered the shelter and asked to speak with Margaret Chen. The shelter director, a woman in her early 50s named Denise, looked at him with suspicion. "Margaret is in labor. Went to the hospital 2 hours ago." "Which hospital?" "St. Vincent Medical Center." "But they won't let you in unless you're family." Richard didn't wait to hear more. He ran back to the car and told the driver to go to St. Vincent as fast as possible. When he arrived at the hospital, Richard went to the maternity ward reception. "I'm here to see Margaret Chen." "Are you family?" the receptionist asked. Richard hesitated, then said something that surprised him. "Yes, I'm a very old family friend." The receptionist checked the computer. "She's in room 412. But she just went into active labor. You'll have to wait in the waiting room." Richard sat in the maternity ward waiting room, a place he had never been before. Around him were nervous future fathers, anxious grandparents, impatient siblings. Entire families gathered to celebrate new life, and Richard Whitmore, with $140 million and a 22-bedroom mansion, was completely alone. He waited for 7 hours. During that time, he watched family after family being called, saw faces light up when nurses appeared with good news, saw tears of joy, hugs, laughter, and for the first time in his adult life, Richard Whitmore wondered if he had made the right choices. He had built an empire, had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But who was there to celebrate with him? Who cared about his victories beyond what they meant in terms of financial return? Finally, at 3:42 in the morning, a nurse came out. "Margaret Chen." Richard stood up immediately. "How is she?" "Mother and baby are fine. A healthy girl, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Can I see them?" The nurse hesitated. "Are you family?" Richard opened his mouth to repeat the same lie, but then told the truth. "No, I'm not. But I knew her mother, and I would like to see if she's okay." Something in his honesty must have touched the nurse. "Let me ask her." 5 minutes later, the nurse returned. She said, "You can come in. Room 412. Richard walked down the corridor with hesitant steps. When he reached the room, he knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Margaret's voice said, weak but clear. Richard entered. Margaret was in the bed, pale and exhausted, but there was a light in her eyes he had never seen before. In her arms was a small bundle of pink blankets. "You came," she said, surprised. "I came." Richard approached slowly. "How are you?" "Tired, but happy." She looked at the baby in her arms with love so pure that Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "It's a girl?" he asked. "It is." Margaret smiled. "Do you want to meet her?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. Margaret gently adjusted the baby so he could see better. A perfect little face. Eyes closed, small fists clenched. "She's beautiful," Richard whispered. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said. "You didn't have to, I know. But I wanted to. I needed to." Richard paused. "Margaret, about what happened with your mother, about how I treated her. I was wrong, completely, inexcusably wrong." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "My mother used to say that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. She forgave you a long time ago, Mr. Whitmore. Maybe it's time you forgave yourself." "I don't know if I can," Richard admitted, and for the first time in decades there was real honesty in his voice. "Then start small," Margaret suggested. "Start by doing better from here forward." Richard nodded. He looked again at the baby. "You said your mother wanted you to tell me the baby's name. Why?" Margaret smiled, and there was something mischievous in that smile. "Because she said if you knew, maybe you'd remember who you used to be, before you were so afraid of being human." "What's her name?" Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at Richard. "Her name is Grace Sarah Chen." Richard felt like someone had punched his stomach. "Grace. Do you remember?" Margaret asked softly. Richard nodded slowly. Grace was his mother's name, The woman who had died when he was only 7 years old, the last person who had loved him unconditionally before he built all those walls. "How did your mother know?" he whispered. "You told her. Once working late, you mentioned your mother, mentioned that she always believed the best in people, that she saw grace, goodness even in dark places. And you said that when she died, that ability to see goodness died with her." Tears that Richard hadn't cried in 50 years began falling down his face. "I had forgotten that, forgotten I told her. My mother never forgot. And she wanted you to know that ability to see goodness didn't die. You just buried it, but it's still there. She named her daughter Grace to remind you of that." Richard fell to his knees beside the hospital bed. 58 years of walls, of protection, of fear, of loneliness, all crumbling in that moment. "I wasted my entire life," he said through sobs. "Built everything and have nothing that matters. It's not too late," Margaret said gently. "You're still here. You can still choose differently." Richard looked at that baby, at that child named Grace, in memory of a goodness he had buried so long ago he almost forgot it existed. "Let me help," he said suddenly. "You and Grace. Let me do this right this time." Margaret studied him carefully. "I don't need charity, Mr. Whitmore. It's not charity. It's redemption. It's me trying to be the person my mother thought I could be. The person your mother still believed I could be." Margaret thought for a long moment. "Then you can start by calling me by my name, not Miss Chen or that woman." "Margaret." Richard nodded. "Margaret. And you can call me Richard." "Okay, Richard. We can start there." In the 6 months that followed, Richard Whitmore changed more than he had changed in the previous 30 years. He established a trust fund for Grace that would ensure her education and financial security. But more important, he became present in ways money couldn't buy. He showed up at the small apartment he had rented for Margaret, didn't send James to do it. He drove there himself, brought groceries, sat on the floor and played with Grace, learned how to change diapers, how to hold a bottle, how to make a baby stop crying, and slowly those walls around his heart began to crumble. He established a foundation in Sarah Chen's name to help single mothers working multiple jobs, provided free childcare, professional training, and temporary financial support. The first beneficiary was Denise from the shelter where Margaret had stayed, but the biggest change came in how he treated the people around him. His employees noticed he started asking their names, asking about their families, seeing human beings where before he saw only resources. James, the security guard, was shocked when Richard asked about his son who was fighting leukemia, and was even more shocked when Richard quietly paid for all the treatment. 1 year after that day in the rain, Richard was again in his mansion's living room, but this time he wasn't alone. Margaret was there, with Grace, now 1 year old, tottering in her first uncertain steps. Richard sat on the floor, arms extended. "Come here, Grace. You can do it." Grace took 3 wobbly steps before falling into his arms, laughing. Richard picked her up, and the sound of her laughter filled that house that had been silent for so long. "You're good at this," Margaret said, smiling. "I'm learning." Richard looked at her. "Margaret, I want to ask you something." "Okay, I know I'm not family, not by blood, but I would like to be part of Grace's life, not as a distant benefactor, but as," he hesitated, looking for the right word, "as a grandfather," Margaret suggested gently. Richard felt tears stinging his eyes again, something that happened much more frequently now. "I don't deserve that title. Deserving isn't about the past, Richard. It's about the present and the future. It's about who you choose to be now. Tell me in the comments, do you believe people can really change, or does the past always define who we are?" Richard looked at Grace in his arms. This child named Grace. This child who had helped him find the Grace he thought he'd lost forever. "Then yes," he said, "I would very much like to be her grandfather, if you'll let me. On one condition," Margaret said. "Anything. You stop punishing yourself for the past. My mother forgave you. I forgave you. Now you need to forgive yourself and move forward." Richard nodded. He could do that. Or at least he could try. 5 years passed. Grace was now 6 years old and in first grade. Every Friday, Richard picked her up from school and they went for ice cream together. She called him Grandpa Rich, and that title meant more to him than any other he had earned in his life. Margaret had returned to college, studying nursing. Richard had offered to pay for everything, but she insisted on accepting help only with childcare and books. The rest, she wanted to earn herself. Richard respected that. He was still CEO, still ran his company, but now there was balance, there was purpose beyond profit. He had established paid parental leave policies, created on-site childcare for employees, raised base salaries to ensure nobody working for him needed multiple jobs to survive. His shareholders complained he was being too generous. His profits responded by showing that happy employees were productive employees. His turnover rate dropped 82%. His productivity increased 63%. Turns out, treating people like human beings was also good business. Who knew? One Friday afternoon, Richard and Grace were at their favorite ice cream shop. Grace had chosen chocolate with brownie chunks. Again, she always chose that. "Grandpa Rich," she said, ice cream staining her face. "Why don't you have other grandchildren?" Richard paused, spoon in the air. "Well, because I never had children." "Why not?" "It's complicated, sweetheart." "Because you were too busy working?" she asked with the brutal honesty only 6-year-olds possess. "Yes, and because I was afraid." Afraid of what? Richard thought about how to answer this. Afraid that if I loved someone, they might hurt me, or leave me, or just want my money. "That's silly," Grace said with absolute confidence. "Mommy says love doesn't hurt. Fear hurts. Love heals. Your mother is very wise." "I know." Grace took another spoonful of ice cream. "Are you still afraid?" Richard looked at that child. This child who had entered his life by chance and changed absolutely everything, sometimes, but much less than before. "Well, you don't need to be afraid," Grace said, "because I love you, and I'm never going to leave you." Richard felt that familiar tightness in his chest. Even after 5 years, it still surprised him. The capacity to feel, to love, to be vulnerable. "I love you too, Grace, more than you can imagine." When he dropped Grace and Margaret home that night, Margaret stopped him at the door. "Richard, can I show you something?" "Sure." She went to a closet and took out an old box. They sat at the kitchen table and she opened it. Inside were old photos. Sarah when young, Sarah pregnant, Sarah holding baby Margaret. And then Margaret pulled out a photo that made Richard stop breathing. It was him and Sarah. He barely remembered that photo being taken. They were in his office, late at night, working on some project. Someone must have taken it as a joke. In the photo, Richard was explaining something, hands gesturing, and Sarah was looking at him with an expression Richard had never noticed before. It was admiration, respect, and something more. Something that made his heart ache 30 years later. "She kept this all these years?" he whispered. "This and others," Margaret said, showing more photos. "You were in many of her important memories, Richard. Even after everything, you mattered to her." Richard held that photo, looking at the younger version of himself. A man who hadn't yet built all those walls. A man who still knew how to laugh, how to connect, how to see people as people. "I wish I could tell her I'm sorry," he said. "That she was right about me, that there was goodness buried, and that her daughter and granddaughter helped me find it again." "I think she knows," Margaret said gently, "and I think she's proud of you." That night, Richard returned to his mansion, but it didn't feel so empty anymore. The walls had photos now, photos of Grace, photos of Margaret, photos of moments worth more than all his millions. He went to the office and looked out the window at that iron gate. That same gate where 5 years ago he had ordered a pregnant woman expelled in the rain. If he could go back in time, he would have done everything differently, but he couldn't. All he could do was be better now, be better from here forward. His phone rang. It was Margaret. "Grace wanted me to call to say goodnight," she said. He heard Grace's voice in the background. "Good night, Grandpa Rich. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." he responded, his voice breaking. After he hung up, Richard sat in silence. He thought about his mother, the original Grace, and what she would have thought of all this. He thought about Sarah, who had seen goodness in him even when he couldn't see it in himself. He thought about Margaret, who had offered forgiveness when he didn't deserve it. And he thought about little Grace, the child who had been named for Grace and had brought exactly that into his life. Richard Whitmore had spent 58 years building an empire. And it had taken a 6-year-old child to teach him what really mattered. It wasn't the 15 million in property. It wasn't the 140 million in net worth. It wasn't the awards or recognition or Forbes magazine appearances. It was a child saying, "I love you." It was being called Grandpa. It was knowing that when he was no longer here, someone would miss him not for the money he left, but for the memories he created. 2 years later, Richard was sitting in the audience at Grace's dance recital. She was 8 years old and doing her first solo. She was nervous. He could see from the way she kept shifting her weight from one foot to another, waiting for her turn. When the music started and Grace glided onto the stage, Richard leaned forward. She was graceful, confident, beautiful. And when the solo ended and she took her bow, her eyes searched the audience until they found him. He was standing, applauding louder than anyone else there, tears streaming down his face without shame, because he had learned that tears weren't weakness. Tears were proof you could still feel, could still love, were still human. After the recital, Grace ran to him. "Did I do good?" "You were perfect," he said, picking her up and spinning her. "I'm so proud of you." Margaret approached, smiling. "You've become a complete doting grandpa," she teased. "No shame whatsoever," Richard agreed. As they drove home that night, Grace sleeping in the back seat, Margaret looked at Richard. "You know, my mother was right about you." "About what?" "That you just needed someone to believe in you, to see beyond the walls, to remember who you were before fear took over. She gave me a gift beyond measure," Richard said. "She gave me you two, gave me purpose, gave me family, gave me a second chance to do things right. You did things right, Richard. Look at everything you've changed. Not just for us, but for hundreds of people through your policies, your foundation, your generosity. I was just trying to make up for decades of selfishness. Maybe. Or maybe you were just becoming who you were always supposed to be." When they arrived home, Richard carried sleeping Grace inside. He put her in bed, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and kissed her forehead. "Love you, Grandpa Rich," she murmured, half asleep. "Love you too, sweetheart, more than anything in the world." And in that moment, Richard Whitmore realized something. He still had $140 million, still had the mansion, the cars, all the external symbols of success. But if all of that went away tomorrow, if he lost every penny, he would still be the richest man in the world, because he had something money could never buy. He had love, had family, had purpose, had grace. All because a pregnant woman showed up at his gate in the rain. All because he finally had the courage to open that gate. All because of a name, Grace. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the people you judge, about the second chances you deny, about the walls you build, share it with someone. Because the truth is, we're all one closed gate away from losing something precious. The millionaire ordered the pregnant woman expelled. But when he heard the name she gave the baby, he discovered something more valuable than all his fortune. He discovered it's never too late to change, never too late to tear down the walls, never too late to choose love instead of fear. Grace Sarah Chen saved Richard Whitmore, not with money, not with power, but with something much more powerful, with grace. Pure, simple, transformative grace. And maybe we all need a little more grace in our lives. Grace for others, and grace for ourselves. Don't let fear build walls so high you miss the chance to meet the people who will change your life. Don't let judgment blind you to the humanity right in front of you. Because sometimes the greatest blessing of your life shows up wet, desperate, begging for help. And everything depends on whether you're going to open the gate or keep it closed. Richard opened the gate, and that made all the difference. The